Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. If you haven't already started up the VMware virtual machine, make sure you start that up. And then also start up the Docker machine. We're gonna return to this screen a little bit later on so that we can look at the correct IP address to view the stuff that's being broadcast by Apache from one of the containers. Okay, so I'll bring that back up again later. And we're going to do now is go to Laulima, and in the resources area, let's just click on daily work and go to the file with today's date, a folder with today's date on it, and you can just click on that file. We're going to do some PHP programming, and when we do that, I'm going to upload a compressed folder with the files that I work on. I'm going to put it in that same daily work folder so that you can take a look at it. So when we do the PHP programming, you can try to do the same thing as I'm doing it, but if it doesn't quite work the way mine is working, don't panic, because the PHP files will be uploaded in a compressed folder up in that same folder, this folder right here, right? So daily work with today's date, that's where I'll put it up eventually. And that's also a reminder that if you try to put up a file with a PHP extension on Laulima, it's going to clobber it and it's going to just replace the contents with an error message. Okay, so it doesn't allow PHP scripts at all. All right, so project one, we're going to work on it, but before we get to it, the first thing I want to do is click on this link. Okay, so this is on the website for 280, and here's an introduction to PHP. PHP, when it first got created, actually stood for Personal Home Page, but then after it got taken over by other people, and now it's an open source project, that actually the company that maintains PHP is Zend, Z-E-N-D. Anyway, so now it stands for PHP Hypertext Processor. It's that GNU style of like naming things, where the acronym stands for something which actually has an acronym as part of it. Okay, so anyway, at the time that I wrote this, over 70% worldwide of web programs are powered in some form or fashion by PHP. It's, of course, therefore, a language that's worth learning if you're going to do any kind of web programming, but also just so that you understand about just web services or one kind of web service in general, then PHP is something that's worth learning. We're going to look at some programs. We're going to do some basic things. You'll see the syntax is like Java, okay? But you can, just like in Python, not do object-oriented programming. PHP, most of the time, people do a lot of programming without resorting to objects. Okay, although we will make use of some objects, but not objects that we had to create the class for. So that's sort of like how you do Python programming most of the time, unless you're doing object-oriented programming. Okay, so here's the things we need to do to start to do some PHP programming. Okay, so we'll kind of do this in stages, so we won't do everything that we'll eventually get to all at once, but we'll first do some command line programming, and then we're going to get to some stuff where we show stuff in the browser, because that's where we're most interested in doing things. Okay, so anyway, there's that web page. We're going to refer to it a little bit. I'll go back and forth, but take a look at that when you get a chance. But we're going to create a folder called PHP tests inside of, if you look at our main Docker folder, the Docker CENT280-Win7, inside the docs folder, we're going to create a folder called PHP_test. So let's start off doing that. Okay, so I'm going to go to Documents, and then Docker, and then our main Docker folder, and then inside the Docs folder, and then I'm going to create a folder called php_test. Okay, and then we're going to create some files inside of this in just a little while. Okay, so we'll do that with Genie, but that's where we start. That's the first thing. Okay, then what we want to do eventually is, after we start up the Docker containers, we want to go inside the php-apache container to start doing some things. So up until now, the only Docker container that we actually went inside of to use is the Postgres SQL container, but we're going to now start also using the php-apache container. Okay, so the two Docker containers, we're finally going to use the second of them. Okay, so what we're going to do is open up ConEMU. So let me go ahead and start up a ConEMU terminal. Okay, and the first thing I want to do is add in the environment variables from the Docker machine. And then I'm going to change into the main Docker folder. And then we'll launch the two Docker containers. Okay, so it started up PHP Apache, Postgres SQL, and then PHP Apache. All right, so let's first go into Genie and create a file, and we'll just call this, or we'll just call it first.php or something like that. Okay, so anyway, I start up Genie. Okay, and I'm going to save this file even though it doesn't have anything in it yet. Well, actually, I got to put something in there. So here. So let me save it, okay, into, let's go to CENT280, then into Documents, then Docker, then the main Docker folder, Docs, and then php_test, that's a new folder we created. And I'll just call this first.php as an example of a PHP script. Okay, so once I save it, then it starts to do syntax coloring. What you see there is the start tag and end tag for a PHP block. Okay, so whenever you're going to have PHP inside of a web page, if you got code that you need to execute, it needs to be inside of these two tags. Okay, a long time ago, so many, more than maybe 10 years ago, you used to be able to get away with just the less than, the question mark for the start tag, and the same thing for the end tag, question mark and greater than symbol, without the PHP for the start tag. That is no longer allowed. Okay, so, well, actually, it could be if you configure the Apache server so that it allowed it. But the default setting makes it so this is what you need to include any kind of PHP code inside of a web page. Okay, and if you think about what's going on, what the PHP script is usually going to be for our purposes is going to be part of an HTML file, okay? But we still name it with an extension PHP so that the PHP interpreter is configured to then try to execute those as PHP instructions, whatever it finds in between these two tags. That's very important because sometimes in the PHP file, you will have information that you don't want to be seen by other people. And so if you have some of the sensitive information, you can make it so it isn't broadcast on Apache, okay, as long as you name it .php. Okay, so our web pages now will have a PHP extension. But because they have a PHP extension, right, you cannot upload it directly to Laulima. Got to put it in a compressed file first so that Laulima doesn't clobber it. Okay, so this is actually a PHP file. It doesn't do anything. What we're going to do is just use one of the most basic commands that there is in PHP, and that's the echo command. Okay. Like Java, when you end a statement, you put a semicolon at the end of the line. I can actually run this program on the command line, and that's the way we're going to do it first. Okay, and then we'll look at it in the browser eventually, but that will take more work. So let's just do it first on the command line. Let me save this. Okay, so if I come here to my conemu terminal and I go docker compose and I run the execute command, but instead of typing PostgreSQL, I'm going to type php-apache and then bash after that. Then we'll go into not the PostgreSQL container, but the PHP Apache container. Okay, so up until now, in this course, we didn't even use this container. It's like we didn't even know it existed as far as we're concerned. Okay, but now we want to do this because we wanted to do some PHP stuff. PHP was installed in conjunction with Apache because eventually we want to view the results inside of a web page using a web browser. Okay. We'll do some command line stuff first, okay, but that's what eventually we want to get to. Okay, so if I do an ls here, let's see, oh, there's just test. We want to go first to /home. Oh, wait, I think I put the folder in the wrong location. Yeah, I did, sorry. Okay, so my instructions that I gave you, they're not correct. Okay, so let me do things in the right order to fix it. First, I'm closing up Genie, so that file is no longer open inside of Genie. Then I'm going to Windows Explorer, and this PHP test, what we're going to do is move it inside of the CENT280 folder. Okay, so my mistake. Okay, so I'm going to grab this folder, and I'm going to put it inside of CENT280. So you can see it's inside of CENT280 now. The reason why is that what gets mapped to the PHP Apache container is different from what gets mapped to the PostgreSQL container. And actually, I want to put it inside the CENT280 container. What you can think is from this point forward, when we want to do something that involves PHP, it has to be somewhere inside of this CENT280 folder, okay, that's inside our main Docker folder. Okay, so here's our main Docker folder. When we go into docs, CENT280, that's all the stuff that we got to use for PHP. So actually my notes are incorrect. I got to go change that after class. But PHP_test should be inside of CENT280, which is inside the docs folder inside of our main Docker folder. Okay, any questions on that? Yeah, sorry, I messed that up. Okay, so if I come back to here, okay, and I switch back to the directory that it started off in, which is /var/www/docs/cent280. And the reason why it needs to be there is the way that the Apache server has been configured is that this is what we call the document root, or sometimes called the web root or the web document root. That means Apache is going to be capable of broadcasting anything inside this folder, including some folders. And that's what we want to do. Okay, so if I do an ls this time, you can see the php_test folder in there. So let me go ahead and change to that. Okay, so that's now my location. So I moved it inside of docs, and I moved it into the CENT280 folder inside of docs, which is now the correct location. If I do an ls, you can see that first.php shows up. All right. So if I run this file just from the command line, I can do two things. Okay, one is what we call checking for syntax errors, or the lint test, L-I-N-T. And what that does is it checks for syntax errors. Okay, so if you look at actually the lint tools, those are used to do, among other things, check for syntax errors. So the -L looks sort of like a 1. Okay, but if you look at this little line on the top, it's horizontal instead of slanting down, so that's actually in this font, that's a L. So php-L means let's run lint on this so we check for syntax errors. This is one of the most important commands you can do when you're doing PHP programming because you're trying to create a web application. Because most of the times when stuff is set up, you're not going to be able to see the errors inside the browser if you're using any Debian-based default installation of Apache. It's going to specifically prevent the errors from being shown in the browser, and that's because when people use your web application, you don't want them seeing errors. If it doesn't work, you want them to see a blank page. You don't want them to see errors. Yeah. Oh, hang on. Yeah, you're not inside the folder, right? So okay, so first, okay, start it up, right? But we don't need to do this, right? To get to the root problem. So you were in the host, not inside the container.
When I put in this one,
Okay, you're in that directory. So let's check. The containers are loaded. No, okay, so you didn't even get the environment variables in here. Yeah.
oh, I did. The IEX, right? I did that one at the top.
But this command didn't work, so it doesn't look like you had this. It didn't work or something. Okay, so those are up, right?
Okay.
So now what you have to do is okay.
So we're good. Look at this. I put it up here. Oh, host is not running.
Yeah,
Oh, it was
didn't
still
quite
loading.
start up yet probably. Okay, so no syntax errors, that's a good thing. Then I'm going to go php-f first.php. Okay, the difference between -l and -f is -l just checks for syntax. php-f will load the file and execute the commands that are in the file. And then if you look, it put hello. But because I didn't put a new line character at the end of it, then it shows up and the prompt is on the same line, so it looks kind of funny. So let's go ahead and fix that. So what I need to do is open this up in Genie again. Remember I closed it so I could move the file, because otherwise Genie is looking in the wrong place for this. So what I'm going to do is I want to put in a new line character here. Okay, so I'm going to show you the concatenation operator, and I'm going to put that in. Now look at the syntax coloring. Okay, there's two ways to define a string in PHP. But with the single quotes, it's a pure literal string. Okay? With double quotes, it does variable interpolation, and it also recognizes escape characters like this. So this is the new line character. If I put \n inside the single quotes, it's going to treat it actually as the characters \n, which we'll do in a little while so you can see the difference. Okay, let me save this. And then I'm going to run this again. This time, because there's a new line character, right, then you can see when the prompt shows up again, then it shows up in a way that we expect it to, right? It doesn't have hello that looks like it's part of the prompt. That's because there was no new line character. Now suppose I had made this mistake, and instead of putting the new line character here, I tried to put it inside the single quotes, which is just a literal string. Hang on, let me run this, and then you see what happens. Hello \n, right? So that's not a new line character. It's literally the two characters \n, n, because single quotes is a literal string. Okay, double quotes will do variable interpolation, which I'll show you folks in a little while, and then also.
No, I just wanted to ask, you know, the Apache stuff you're talking about, should we like note that in our project, or?
The setup for
Yeah.
Apache? No, you can assume that the containers exist as they do.
Okay.
Okay, so you don't have to say anything about the Apache configuration. Okay, yeah. Okay, so what Kendall was asking, and that's actually a very good reminder for everyone, is that when you're thinking in terms of the project, you got to think of like setup for the project. Do you have to say anything about how Apache is configured? The answer is no. You can assume that when your project gets tested, the containers for Docker are set up exactly the way that you have it set up in class. So you don't have to explain about that part of it. Okay, so when we get to parts that I say this is important that you need to take into account, then I will say that. Okay, but it's a very good thing that he mentioned it, because remember, for the project, the documentation part is a huge component of the score. So as we're going along, you got to start making notes of things so that when it comes time to turning in the project, you have basically a very good description of the setup, as well as what we're doing with the passwords, right? How the passwords are stored. Okay, so to fix this, I could use the double quotes, and what Genie does, the syntax coloring, it changes it to green instead of that kind of orangish color. So it tells you that that's a different kind of string. And it actually does that for most languages, because stuff like Python, single quotes and double quotes, you know, you could use either one, but you got to stay consistent with it, and it'll tell you if you have a mismatched set of quotes and things like that. Okay, so if I do this and run it, then it goes back to being a new line character. Now we call it variable interpolation, even though we haven't shown that so far, because of the following. So we're going to modify this a little bit. We're going to define our first variable in PHP, and the way you define variables, it always has to start with the dollar symbol. Okay? Don't forget that. It's easy to forget, but try to remember it when you do PHP programming. So here, I'm defining the variable $name. Okay, so that's the way we name variables. You cannot go name. $name is the only way you can define variables in PHP. Every variable in PHP has to have the dollar symbol in front of it. Okay, that's just the way that the language was defined. So sort of like Perl, but Perl has more, there's 3 different characters that you can put in front to designate what kind of variable it is. Okay, but PHP is simpler. Just got to have a dollar symbol. Okay, little bit different from shell scripting, right, where you have like $1, $2, because in shell scripting, the $1, $2, those are the names for the arguments typically, and you cannot change the 1 and the 2, right? This is how you just define a name like this. Okay, but it is like the shell. If I define some variable, when I want to show the value of that variable, you got to put a $sign in front of it. But when you define the variable, there's no $sign. Okay, so PHP has none of those kind of things. Any variable has a $sign. Okay, that's part of the name. All right. So if I go back and change this a little bit, okay, and I put $name inside of this, then because it's inside the double quotes, it's going to do variable interpolation. Okay, so let's put a comment in here. Comments are like Java. So if I put 2 slashes like this, that's for a line comment. Okay, so variable interpolation. It's a fancy way of saying that instead of printing out $name, it's going to substitute the value for $name here and interpolate it into there. So it should say, hello, Jane Doe, when I run this. Okay, so I'm going to save this. And I'm going to run it again. And it says, hello, Jane Doe. Okay, so double quotes will enforce variable interpolation. Let's add to this program so that you can see the difference. Okay, so I'll go echo. Okay, so on my line 6, you can see Jeannie thinks that this is something different. So when you use single quotes, it gives it a different color because it's trying to tell you this is something that's different. And it's correct. It's not the same thing. So instead of this time printing out hello Jane Doe, it's going to print out hello $name because it's literal string, right? You get literally whatever's inside of the single quotes. So if I run this, okay, the first line, right, shows the variable interpolation working. The second line shows that it's simply a literal string. Okay, so this is a good way to see the difference between single quotes and double quotes. Now, in Python, one of the reasons to use single quotes for a string is because the string that's contained within those single quotes has a double quote. So it's an easy way to get double quotes in like that. You could certainly do that in PHP as well. My personal preference, if I'm doing a lot of web application, is to always use double quotes so that I have access to escape characters as well as variable interpolation. And when I want to have double quotes inside of double quotes, then I use the escape character for it. Okay, so if I did something like this, Okay, so I will echo. Sorry, typed that out wrong. Okay, so what I could have done to get the double quotes around good is use single quotes here, then I wouldn't have to escape it. Right? I would just put double quotes because they'll be treated literally as double quote characters. But to make double quotes come out inside of double quotes, you can always escape it with the backslash symbol. But the backslash symbol is going to be treated as escape only if it's enclosed inside of double quotes. Right? So that's how you would use that without having single quotes. So if I'm just defining a simple literal string, you'll see that I use single quotes. But many times when I do PHP scripts, I'm going to be using double quotes for any string so that I have basically the more powerful form of including a string as part of the code. Okay, so if I run this, okay, I got my double quotes around it like that by using the backslash quotes for that. Okay, so that's some relatively simple PHP programming. It's simple enough that what happens is I can just run it on the command line and I can see the results of that. Okay, now we're going to do something a little bit more complex. What we would like to do is view first.php in a browser. But okay, we're not viewing something off the World Wide Web, so we cannot just put a regular URL like http://www something, yeah, www.google.com or whatever. And it's not running at as localhost, okay, which we could have if we set it up that way, but instead we're running the PHP and Apache service from inside a Docker container. So the IP address is not localhost like it would be if we had just this on a Linux, just a regular Linux server, but it's the IP address that is basically viewable from outside the container, right? Because the service is inside the container, we want to see it outside. There's two components to this. Okay, so let's look at each of the components separately. All right, so I told you we're going to return back to this page here. I mean, this is where we just started up the Docker machine. If I type Docker machine IP my Docker, then it's going to show you the IP address. So 192.168.80.131. Okay, that's important. We're going to make use of that. Okay, but that's just the IP part of it. It doesn't tell us what the port is. Now, by default, when we view web pages, we don't put a port number because everything is assumed to be port 80 because that's the default place that it's supposed to be. So if we're going to use something other than port 80, we got to include that as part of the address, right? Part of the address when we're specifying the URL. So let's try to figure out what that would be. Okay, so where it's going to be, you got to take a look at this. Okay, I'm going to come back to the main Docker folder, and I'm going to open up Docker compose.yaml. Okay, this is a configuration file for Docker Compose. Let's review this a little bit. The reason why we're using Docker Compose is because we're opening two Docker containers, the Postgres SQL container and the PHP Apache container. And Docker Compose configuration file, Docker compose.yaml, is used to stitch those things together in the way that we want it to be stitched together. Okay, so I'm going to open this with Genie so we can take a look at it. Okay, this first part here explains how to build the Postgres SQL part, what the port looks like to the outside world versus what it is inside the container. Okay, and then the volumes that are set up, the way it maps from the host into the container. Okay, this is what actually sets up our super user for the PostgreSQL server, right? So that's where, in case you ever forget it, you can look it up right there in the Docker Compose YAML file. All right, and then here's our PHP-Apache container. This shows how to build it. You got to look in this folder in order to build it correctly. But look at the ports. Okay, internally it's 80. Okay, but to the outside, to the host, it's 8080. So the correct address that you need to use is a combination of this, 192.168.80.131 colon 8080, right? Because you got to put the port number when you're doing that. Okay, so if I go to a browser and I'm going to open up another window, okay, this is what I have to do. Okay, so I put 192.168.80.131, I believe it was. Let's double check. Yeah, 131. Okay. Then I have to put a colon 8080. Okay. And then what I need to specify after the IP address colon port is whatever folder I'm trying to look for inside the web document root, which in this case is php_test. That's the name of my folder inside the web document root. And then the name of the file, finally, first.php. Okay? So I hit an enter, and then it shows all of this. Now, how come it doesn't honor the new line characters, right? Right? Got new line characters here. How come in the page it doesn't? That's because the way web browsers work, right? Those are not considered to be actual stuff where you break the string. And the reason why they do that is because if you have, oh, let me do it this way, sorry, right? If you have text and you change the size of the browser window, it ignores the \n type stuff because it wants to be able to reformat it so it fits inside the window like this, right? So it ignores those things. If I wanted basically all those three things to show up on three different lines, I got to add some HTML in order to do that. And I can add the break character, and then that would make it show up on different lines. All right, so how would I do that? Okay, I could put in a break element here and another break element there. And then if I go back to the browser and reload it, then I can make it come out on separate lines. Okay, so if I'm just printing to the console, \n means something. Inside a web browser, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? So if you want it to be forced to go to the next line, you got to add those break elements in there. Now, those are just characters as far as the console is concerned. So if I run the console again, then it looks like this. You see those characters? I put it after the new line character, so that's why it shows up on the next line. So it just shows up like this. You got to learn to just ignore those things if you're looking at it in the console, so that at least within the browser, it shows the kind of lines, okay, or new lines if you want, that you want it to have in there. Okay, so eventually, when we have the correct URL to reach our project one, the best thing to do is set a bookmark to it so you don't have to type out that address again, right? You set a bookmark to it. Now, here's a very important thing. When you're explaining the setup, you need to do a couple of things. You need to explain using this command, docker-machine IP and the name of the Docker machine. The IP address it returns because when you want to view the web application for project 1, that's part of it, right? And the other part of it is, if you look in Docker Compose YAML and the directions for building the PHP Apache container, you need to get the port, right, that gets mapped to the internal port, right? So inside the container would have been 80, the default port for web servers, but to the outside the container, it shows up as 8080. So you need to have basically an explanation of that part of the address. Okay, that's a good way to, yeah. Say 192.168.80.131. Now, why do you need to explain that? Because even if the Docker container has the same YAML file, right, has the same way that you built it, if the person that's looking at your stuff has more than one more than one set of Docker containers set up, then this address here is not going to be the same. The 8080 would be what's determined by the YAML file, right? Whatever you set it to. Okay, but that first part of the address, the IP part, that depends on how many Docker machines you have actually set up on the computer, okay, or how many different sets of Docker containers that you have. So that's a very important part of what you got to talk about in the setup, right? That's not automatic, right? It's not like if we were all on a Linux host, you could just say localhost, okay, and then it'd be very easy. Okay, localhost : 8080. But now you got to actually specify it. And the way to specify it, show it one more time, right? Docker machine space IP for the IP address and the name of the Docker machine. That basically is how you get that number. Okay? And then later on, when we look at other things, for project 1, there's going to be a different IP address, and that's going to be the IP address of the Postgres SQL service as seen by a PHP script, because you're going across 2 containers in order to do that. So we'll go over that later, but we're not going to hit that today because we're not going to get quite that far today. And we just want to look at some examples of PHP programming for the first part. Okay, so any questions on this? Okay, so those are important things to start noting down in your documentation, right? Got to get the IP address so that when we view it in the browser, we start off the URL with the correct IP address. Okay, so let's add a little bit more to our first.php file. And I want to show you first a common mistake, and then we'll fix it and then get it to work correctly. Oh, we'll do it correctly first, and I'll show you, I'll break it and make it show you a common mistake, and then we'll fix it again afterwards. Let's say what I wanted to do was I wanted to write Jane Doe a number of times. And so I want to repeat that. And one way to do repetition is with a for loop. So let's look at a for loop. Let's set that up. Okay, so I go for $i equals 0, $i less than 10. So it's going to do it 10 times. $i plus plus. Okay. And all I'm going to do is say echo $name. Okay, so I put in the break so that if I view this in the browser, then I should be able to see it show up 1 on each line instead of all on the same line. So first thing I'm going to do after I save this, let me save this, is I'm going to go to the terminal, to the console, and I made some changes. Anytime you make changes to your PHP script, although I didn't do this on the others, I should have been doing this, and that is I should be checking for syntax errors. Okay? So a really, really important step if you're doing web application programming, because when you type some new code, you always want to make sure you didn't introduce some kind of syntax error, okay? Because many times the way the Apache server is configured, in the browser, it's not going to display the syntax errors. It'll just show blank screen, so you don't know what to do to fix it. Okay? In the Docker container we're using, the default for the Apache, it shows it. So you don't have that limitation, but you won't always be working in the same conditions. So learn to check for syntax errors here first. If you find them, you fix it, a lot less problems down the road. Because it could be the screen is blank because you just have a syntax error. It could be that there's no syntax errors, but you have something wrong with your query. So when you're trying to do a select query, it doesn't return anything. That could be another reason why it's blank. If you check for syntax errors first, at least you eliminate the possibility of syntax errors. One less thing to look out for, easier to fix your code. Okay, now, and it doesn't hurt to also, when you make changes, run it from the command line. And then here it's doing, and it looks like it's doing what I want it to do. If all else, everything is working, I come back to this page and hit reload, and I should expect, right, that I get this kind of output. Okay, but I checked it on the command line side first, because it's easier to fix the errors if I check it at that location in the first place. Okay, so I said I was going to do it correctly, and now I'm going to break it. Okay, when you're learning a new language, a lot of times if you just break things by looking at the syntax errors that they generate, you learn that language faster because you learn what the error messages mean. So here, I'm going to do this. Now, if you're used to programming in other languages and you write a for loop, like say in Java, then it's common, right, for the loop variable, you increment it like this, right? You put I++. And in here, this case, what I've done is I've forgotten that all variable names in PHP have to start with the dollar symbol, right? So actually, Genie is trying to help me out, right? Because look, $I is in this light blue color, $I is in this light blue color. I++ is black, okay? But let's say I wasn't paying strong attention to the syntax coloring and I had entered this in. Watch what happens. Okay, so let's go to the command line first. Okay, and then let's run lint on it. And it says, this doesn't even make sense. So you would have caught it, right, at this point. Okay. Now, let's say I didn't run it at the command line. I just went straight to the browser and I hit reload. Because Apache inside of this particular Docker container displays the error messages, you would see that. Otherwise, it would just be blank, and then you don't even know what's causing that problem. Okay. Earlier versions of the PHP interpreter, because this is actually a real recent one, because Docker tries to grab the most recent ones that it has. Okay. So earlier versions of it, what would have happened is that it would have displayed the first few outputs, and this last part, it would just display something really odd, because it would interpret I++ as something. Okay, so you can see, though, the errors show up, and the reason why is simply because for this I forgot to put the dollar symbol. If you do only PHP programming all the time, you probably would not do this. But if you're used to doing programming in Java and stuff like that, it's an easy mistake to make. I know because I made that mistake a bunch of times. Okay? The more recent versions of PHP, the error messages are better. It tells you what's going wrong. Even then, though, when you look at an error message like this, all you really know is on line 9 something is wrong. Okay? Start looking at it. So when you look back here, okay, on line 9, you know it's on this line. Okay? And if you pay attention to the syntax coloring, you would have seen this is in the wrong color. Yeah, when I take that dollar symbol off from it. Okay, so syntax coloring can be really helpful for tracking down bugs, and hopefully helpful at preventing bugs in the first place, right? If you're paying attention to the coloring like this. Okay, So that's what a for loop looks like. We're also going to use while loops a lot. We'll use it in a slightly different way from what I'll demonstrate here, but you certainly could have a while loop to do this. So I'll say something real simple. I'll go $count equals 5, and I'll say while $count is greater than 0, echo $name. Okay, what if I did this? What's wrong with that? Line 15. What's wrong with it? Yeah, missing the $sign. That's why it's black instead of this blue color. Okay, now it looks colored nicely. Let's see if it actually works. Let's go to the command line. Check for syntax errors. No syntax errors. Run it, and then instead of printing Jane Doe 10 times, it prints it 15 times because the while loop prints it 5 more times. Okay? So that's just some examples, some basic programming that we're going to do inside of PHP. Now there's all kinds of things that can be done with PHP. You don't have to use it for web pages. You could just use it as a general purpose programming language. It's not used that way very often because it's made for web pages, but you can. So these things here, the echo statement, the only thing where this has to do with a web browser is that echo will basically put that output inside of the web page. Okay, so the main window of the web browser when you look at it. Okay? Well, yeah, go ahead.
How do you stop it? Mine is like unlimited.
Oh, hit Control C.
Still going. Oh, you have to hold it?
You got to hold down the control while hitting the C. So check to make sure you're decrementing count so that this eventually becomes false. Okay, so that particular code, okay, I'm going to upload it to Laulima. I'm going to make a mistake on purpose when I upload it to Laulima, right? You know what this file looks like, right? So here's my mistake. Okay, I'm coming here, and what I want to do is I want to upload files to that folder. Okay, so I click on this, and I go, let's see, where are my documents, Docker, and docs, CENT280, PHP test, first.php, right? So I put this first.php, the file that you can see right here, okay, and I go continue and I upload it. So if you look inside of this folder on Laulima, you see first.php, right? Now take a look at this file. That's why I said I'm going to do it incorrectly at first. It changes it to an HTML file that has this. Okay, so it does a little bit, right? I mean, it figures out where the file is and everything. But it says, not found. This file doesn't even exist on the server. You know it does, but then this is the message that it puts up. It clobbered it, right? So you can't even see what that is. Okay, so let's remove this. So I click on this, and I go move to trash, and confirm removing it. How do we put PHP scripts? How do we turn in project 1 later on and not get this message back? Sorry, you didn't turn in project 1 because I couldn't see all the files. Okay. Answer is this. I go back to Windows Explorer. Okay. And this folder that has my PHP files, I don't know, PHP_test, it might clobber that one too. So let's take a look at this. So I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to say compress. Where the heck is compress?
7 baby?
You can do it with 7-zip. I thought it also had something where you could just compress it. Okay, well, 7-zip is compressed to PHP test zip. Yeah, we'll just do that. Okay, so it creates this, and inside of this has my first.php. Yeah, I thought there was, oh yeah, you're right. I heard somebody say just use CENT2, and that's correct. CENT2 compressed zip folder. Here it is, and because there was one already, it just labeled it with a 2. Thanks, that's correct. So you just do right-click CENT2, send it to a zip folder, and that's what it is. Okay, so let's say then I go back here and I say upload files, and I click here, and I come up to this level here, and I say, okay, let's upload this one, php test.zip. Continue. Okay, so we got this zip file. It's not clear what it did with this. Let me just click on it. And it asks me if I want to save it. So it's okay like that. So if the zip file contains PHP, but it doesn't have an extension of PHP, it looks like it's okay. So that's an okay way to do it. Whatever you do, compress your files, okay, into a zip file, or from Linux, gzip file, or you can do a zip file also. Then that's what you do. Then you can include PHP code on there. Let's do one more check. Okay, so I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to go save link as. I'm going to just dump it on my desktop. Okay, and there's that file. And I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to go 7-zip and go open archive. And if I look at this, and it's not opening. Okay, now it's in here. Okay, and then if I open this, and I'll just go edit, then it shows it, and it's actually the PHP file. Okay, so it did preserve it as long as I made it into a zip file. Okay, so that's that one script that I have up there. Okay, so that's some basic PHP programming. Definitely take a look at that. We're going to look at how that's used actually to interact with a PostgreSQL database. We won't get to that today probably, but we can also start doing some other kinds of setup for project 1. Okay, so let's look at that. All right, so we come back to here. Okay, so this was getting into the PHP Apache container. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is let's create a database where we can start working on our project 1. Okay, so I'm going to name it proj1_db owner Bob. Now, I didn't put this in before this, but if I'm going to create the database, here's a question. Can I do it from here? No. In fact, if I try to, PSQL not found. Why? Because that's inside the PostgreSQL container. Now, so if you want to leave this terminal so that it's still on the PHP Apache side, you can. So let's open a second conemu terminal. The first thing I want to do is get the environment variables inside of here. Then change to the main Docker folder, and then run docker compose execute, but now go into the PostgreSQL container. Right? So let's do that. Oh, you could also do this, docker container ls, to see that those containers are. We don't have to go docker compose up-d, because those things are already up, right? Those are already loaded into memory. So I go docker compose execute exec PostgreSQL. You type it correct, PostgreSQL, then bash, and then so we can get inside the other container. So now my two terminals that I have, one is inside the PHP Apache container, the other is inside the Postgres SQL container. Inside the Postgres SQL container, I can now get into the database, and then I can create the database that I need, right? So PSQL-U CENT280 man, our super user, I put his database, CENT280DB, and then PGSQL_man. Okay? And remember, if you couldn't remember it, if you look here, that's where it's specified when that thing gets built, right? Okay, so I'm in the CENT280DB. I am logged in as super user. That's why it shows the pound symbol instead of the greater than symbol there. And so I'm going to create a database, proj1_db, and make the owner Bob. And then that's all I want to do as super user. So \Q, quit out of there. Okay, and then I'll be set to start working on stuff like init.sql. Okay, let's take a break right here because we've been going kind of for a long time. Forgot to just stop. So let's take a break. Come back in about 5 minutes, and then we'll start worrying about init.sql and then so forth. Okay, let's get started up again. Okay, so what we're going to do, we created the database. Okay, and then we're going to create a new folder inside of docs called project 1. Now, if you think about it, this folder inside of docs is outside of CENT280, which means that it's not going to be visible to the PHP Apache container, but it will be visible to the Postgres SQL container, which is where we want it to be visible because we're going to put init.sql into it, and then that's, of course, for the database, right? So now we got to worry about two containers. So first thing is, if I go to the docs folder, okay, I'm going to create a new folder called project 1. Okay, and that folder is outside of CENT280. CENT280, remember, that gets mapped into the PHP Apache container. That's going to be the web document root. So the things inside this folder will not be actually available to Apache. Okay? So let's talk about why in a little bit, but that's the folder we want to deal with. And what we want to do is create our init.sql. Okay, so here, let's go to Genie, let's say new, and I'm going to come back to this browser, and it says create the file init.sql with this, and put that inside of that folder. Okay, so I'm going to select this right off of that web page. Okay, so I just copy that here. I'm going to paste it into that new document. Then I'm going to save it inside of the project 1 folder. Okay, so let's go File, Save, and let's start off at CENT280, then go to Documents, Docker, main Docker folder, Docs, Project 1, and then name it init.sql. Okay? So the init.sql for Project 1 is actually very simple because all we need to do is have a table where we can store the user's information. The users are the people that are going to put their username and password and be able to log into the web application. That's all it's there for. Well, let's talk about some of the things that are in here that are going to turn out to be very important. Some is what you might expect for our users table. We got first name and last name, both are text. Okay, the next one is email, is text. And then we're going to say that that's unique. Okay, so in addition to the ID field, which is going to be unique for every user, the email also has to be unique. Okay? And it's a very good idea for a users table to have this second field which is unique, because if you try to add a user that already exists, so the email is already in the table, then it'll prevent you from adding the same user twice. Okay, and that's a very important consideration. Think of if you're trying to search for a user's information, like their password, for example, how much trouble you would have if basically you had the user in there twice, right? And let's say you had them in twice, and the second time the information is correct, but you run across the first one before you hit the second one. That's no good. So you make it unique because everybody should have a different email address. Okay, so that's a good field to make unique. That's to prevent users from getting added in more than once, the same user. Okay, password, text, and you might be thinking, that's terrible. Why would we ever want to store password as just text? Okay, it's because we're not going to even really use that field. Okay, we're just putting it there. What we are going to use is salted and encoded, and the encoded is going to be a salted and hashed password, and those are the things that we're going to store. And let's talk about that just a little bit. We'll talk about it again when we get into some more of the details. But when you encrypt data, that means if you have the decrypt key, you can go back to the original data, right? So when we use stuff like HTTPS and it's using encryption, if you had the correct decryption key, you can go back to the plain text, right? That was basically encrypted. Okay, and then there's lots of stuff that's encrypted. Passwords are not one of those things. What we do is we encode it by basically using a hash. The difference, there's lots of differences, but the key difference between encrypting and encoding, which is hashing is a one-way process. So if I take the original text and I hash it, there's no way to go from the hash value back to the original text. Okay, so when you try to authenticate, you take what they enter as their password, you perform the same hash, and you see if it matches the hash that's stored. But the hash itself can never be converted back to the original. It's a one-way process. So that's why I mentioned earlier, if you have some sort of service and you say, I forgot my password, and then they email you your old password, there's something really wrong with that. Because if they're storing it hashed, which they should, there's no way they can get back your original password. So the best thing, right, when it comes back to you is they send you to a link where you can reset your password, right? That's okay, that's good, that's normal. If they send you your password, okay, that's not good, okay? They send you your username. If you forgot using, that's okay, right? Because that's just your username. Okay, but if they send you your password, they're storing your password as clear text. Very bad. Someone breaks into that, then they have access to all those accounts. Okay, so we're going to use a salt, and then our encoded password is going to be salted and hashed. We'll talk more about what it means, but basically if you use a salt and you hash it, it's more secure than just hashing it. Okay, and if you use a random salt and then you hash it, then it's even more secure. If you're going to use a random salt, you got to store the salt that you're using as part of that user's record. Okay, and then none of those things, okay, will be meaningful to anyone that doesn't know how those things were applied. So it's fine. And when you see the salt and when you see the encoded password, there's no way you can tell at all what the original password was. Okay, so if someone gets in to see that, they basically don't have anything yet unless they know exactly how you built stuff up. Okay, and even then, they won't be able to work backwards towards it. Okay, all right. So part of what you're going to be talking about for Project 1 is using salted and hashed passwords. So at least make a note that that's something that you're going to have to say something about. We're going to go into more details of that later on. But remember that you're going to have to say something about that and something about why you never want to store it as clear text. right? Clear text means I look at the password, I see exactly what the password is. Very, very bad idea. Should never, ever, ever be done, okay? Unless you're just demonstrating something that's really poorly set up. Yeah? So keep that in mind. Start making notes, start thinking, okay, this is important. The way we store the password is important. Why don't we want to store it as clear text? What do we do instead? When we hash it, it's one way. You can never go from the hash value back to the original text that created it. Now, is it possible to have two different strings? Why not with the same hash? Yes, that is possible. Okay? And when they make rainbow tables, they take that into account because they don't really care if they got the original string that created the hash. They just care about getting a string that produces the same hash. That's how rainbow tables are set up to work. We'll talk about that more on a different day. Okay, so if I go back here to my second shell, okay, what I want to do is I want to change into home directory /home, and then my newly created project 1 folder, and do an ls to see that init.sql has been saved there. Okay, and it is in my case. Okay, so this file, right, I saved it and it's in the correct location. Okay, so I can go into the database as Bob. Okay, so some pass. Okay, and I can go /i init.sql, and it just created that table. If I do \d, I can see that it created that table and that sequence. If I do \d, put a space, and I put users for the name of the users table, then it'll show me the definition of all of those things. So basically everything is text except the ID. Okay, and you might be worried, oh, are we going to store the password as just clear text? No, we're not going to do that. Actually, that's just there basically to throw off somebody that breaks into this table that's not supposed to have access to the table. Okay, so anyway, that's what you should see if you include it. Okay, so that's the first step, just creating init.sql like that. And you got init.sql, just pull it directly off of this. It's relatively simple compared to the databases we have so far, but before that, that's because for the application we're going to use it for, that's all we have to have, just that one table, users table. All right, so then we connect to it as Bob, and then we include init.sql just like I just did. So if you did this, right, included it, you're able to display the users table like this, it works okay. And basically, that's where you need to get to at least up until this point. Okay, so I'm going to take a short break here. If you had trouble with this, raise your hand, I'll come around and help you with it. Then we'll take a look at one more thing, because we have time for it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to actually take our first look at connecting a PHP script to a PostgreSQL database. Since we have both containers open, let's take a look at something like that. Okay, so let's do the following. I'm going to quit out of my proj1_db database, and let's go back to Windows Explorer. And Windows Explorer, inside the docs folder, anything we want to do with on the PHP side, it has to be inside of CENT280. Okay, so we have our PHP test there. I guess, yeah, let's use that. We'll reuse that folder. And let's make something that will connect to one of the PostgreSQL databases. So I'm going to come back here and I'll just connect Bob back up to the lab1db database. let's just remind ourselves what was in there. Cars, customers, sales. So if I did this, for example, select star from cars, in lab 2, we populated that table, right, with the make, model, and price for a bunch of cars. So lab 1 underscore DB, we know there's a cars table, and we got 12 records inside of that cars table. Okay, so that's all I wanted to establish there. Okay, so on this side, we're inside the PHP test folder, but we need to create the script in the host. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that. Okay. And so let's create a new file. Okay, and I'll explain about that in just a little bit. I want to save it in my PHP underscore test folder. And then I'm gonna call this connect underscore lab1.php. Okay, so this time I'm actually going to put an HTML markup section, okay, which you're going to make use of probably a little bit. Might run out of time, so I'm not sure how much of that we're going to make use of. But here is what we would like to do. We would like to use PHP to connect to a PostgreSQL database. However, that database is inside of a different container from the PHP Apache container. So when we connect to it, we need to have some additional information that we normally don't need to have. Okay, so let's start by creating something called the PDO string. Okay. And PDO, which actually stands for PHP Data Objects, is a database agnostic way of talking to a database. When we say database agnostic, once you perform the connection, the commands you use are the same whether it's a PostgreSQL database, an Oracle database, or a MySQL database. The instructions are all the same once you connect. So the connection part is the part that takes into account what kind of database it is. You also need to specify things like the the database name, the username, the password, as well as the host. Now, in lots of times when you're doing all of the stuff not inside of Docker containers, but just on a Linux server, then the host would be just specified as localhost. Okay? Then you would have DB name. All right, let me spell it. DB name, and that would be, in this case, lab1 underscore DB. And then I put a space here. Okay, make sure there's a space. Then I would have user, and then password. Okay, and that would be my PDO string. That's a PHP data object string for connecting. Now, it's not correct yet, okay, but that's the basic format for it. The problem is this: the host, the IP address of localhost is not going to work. But let's look at this for a little while. Okay, so then you create an object like this. So in PHP, when you do object-oriented programming, like Java, you use a new keyword every time you're trying to call a constructor. Okay, so new PDO based upon this string. Okay, and you just want to check to see if this thing exists. and print an error message in case you can't get to it. And I'll upload this one afterwards so you don't have to type everything in. This is not going to work at first. And the reason why is that this IP address of localhost 127.0.0.1 is not correct, okay, because they're in two separate containers. All right, so how do we know this is not going to work? Well, we don't, so let's check it out. So let me go to my first shell. If I do an ls here, right, there's that connect lab1.php that I just created. First thing, let's check for syntax errors. Right? Always check for syntax errors. No syntax errors. So I'm going to try to run it. Okay? And we get all these kind of errors saying, is the server actually running on this and accepting on port 5432? Well, the port is 5432, but this is not, right, what the PostgreSQL server is. It's not this address. So that's why this is not working. That's why we get this error message. Well, that's to be expected because we're in two separate containers. It's not going to have a real simple IP address like this, right? It's not, because it's not local. It's in two separate containers. All right. So here, we're going to do this today. We're going to do it again probably a couple other days because it's an easy process to get confused on. Okay? And what we want to do is figure out, okay, what is the actual correct IP address for the PostgreSQL server looking from the point of view of outside that container, right? Because if I'm in the PHP Apache container, I'm not inside the PostgreSQL container. Okay, so let's return to this one. I'm inside this database, but then let me quit out of there. And I'm going to exit out of my PostgreSQL container so that now I'm in the host. I'm outside of either of the containers. But I'm at a prompt which at least has access to the Docker instructions. That's because I already ran the environment variables in the Docker machine, so I have the Docker instructions. So if I do this one, we did this one before, I can show which containers are running, right? The PHP Apache container is running, the PostgreSQL container is running. Okay, now, let's do this. Docker network list. List all the networks that are running. Okay, so if you look at this, the important one is the one that it's taking from our main Docker folder name, right, and a Docker compose file. Okay, this one here, Docker CENT280 Win7. So notice that it knocks out things like hyphens or underscores, and then it puts default. And look at the network ID. It starts with 2A06F3. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to go Docker network inspect. Oh, let me spell it correct. Inspect, and then instead of typing out that whole set of numbers, I'm going to put 2A06F3. I just put the first 6 or so because that's usually enough to uniquely identify the ID. And then I hit an enter, and I see all this stuff show up. And what I really wanted to get to, okay, is the part that says gateway. Okay, so I could look up here, and then the gateway is 172.19.0.1. Let's do it in a slightly different way. Okay, so let me clear the screen. Put this command, okay, but then I put a pipe, group regular expression, and then I'll put -i so that it doesn't matter case sensitivity. I want to get the gateway IP address. Okay, so I type gateway, and then it just returns the one line that has gateway on it, and I got 172.19.0.1. Okay, let me go over it again. Going to go over it again a couple other days, but let me go over it again. Okay, so first thing I went Docker network ls, I listed the networks, then I noticed that the the ID, the identification string, starts off with 2A06F3. So I went Docker network inspect, so I can take a closer look at this, 2A06F3. Then I pipe it to group regular expression, ignore case, right, gateway, and then it shows me 172.19.0.1. Okay, so I go back to my file, this connection one, instead of localhost, what I need to do is put in this address, 172.19.0.1. Okay, and then go back to the other shell, right? And I'm going to try to run this again. Now I don't get the error message and it displays the HTML markup, so I connect it. Okay, so let's take a look at this, and I'll upload this file later on. Don't worry about typing out. Common errors that people make is that there has to be a space between this and the U in user. So to be extra careful, and remember, dot is a concatenation operator. It's not like plus for Python or Java. It's a dot. That's concatenation. I put a space here, and I put a space here to make sure that they're not stuck together. But that's a real common mistake. People don't put spaces in between each of the parameters, and then therefore it doesn't set up the right string. Okay, so that's a common mistake. This thing right here, you gotta check this. So, does your setup for doing project 1 include looking up that IP address? Yes, it does. We're gonna do this at least 2 other days, okay, but so at least make a note that it's important to be able to get that. If you wrote down that these are instructions to get it, Docker network ls, to see all the stuff, then you see this is the network we're using. Okay, you get the first few, maybe the first 6 or so letters of the ID for that network. Then you go Docker network inspect, you put those ID numbers, okay. Then you pipe it to group regular expression I, so you don't have to look at that whole list of things, but you just look at the one line that contains this. That's the correct address for the Postgres SQL server from outside. And the PHP Apache container is outside the Postgres SQL container. So that's why you need to use that. Okay, so when you use Docker, you can get it so we can run these basically Linux services and commands on a Windows machine. Nice thing. If I had a Linux host, I can get those without actually installing those things onto the server itself. But you put in the container, so you wipe out the container, then those services are not there. You can also make it lots of different containers running different versions of the same service within those containers. So it's really, really good for that. But it comes at a price. And this is one of the prices. I gotta go and look at what the correct IP address it is to connect my PHP script to a Postgres SQL container, because they're not in the same containers, right? And that's the way that Docker works. So you gain something, but then it comes at some cost. That's understanding how Docker works. When I first started working with Docker, it took me a long time to figure this out. I had to search online for literally days before I figured out this is the simplest way to get that. I could get this, but it was like so many ways that were so convoluted, you know, it's not the right way. But this is exactly the right way to do it. That's what you want to take note of, because that's important part of the documentation. Okay. Okay. So let's play around a little bit with this. All right. So what I'm going to do is this. If this doesn't execute, it means I connected. So $PDO contains a PDO connection to the database. I can pass that a query, okay, and then I can use the query, and I'm going to populate something here inside of inside of my HTML markup. So let's do that. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to create a SQL script. It's just a string right at this point, and this string doesn't contain any special variables or anything like that. So I could use single quote. Select star from cars. Okay. If you recall, lab1_db has a table named cars, and we're going to just select all the records from cars. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say $results. Okay, so another variable is going to be $PDO. Is going to run the function called query on $SQL. Okay, so this object is something like that cursor object that we looked at, right, once we were connecting to the database from Python, right? So when we were using that PsychoPG2 stuff, we got a cursor. This is sort of like that cursor. And what we can do is that we can run a select query, that's what this is for, and pass it the string that the query we want to run. So essentially, this is like if we were inside of PSQL at this point, running select star from cars and storing the record set that gets returned inside this variable $results. Now, $results is going to have more than one record, right? We had 12 records when we go select star from cars, right? 12 rows. So what I'd like to do, okay, is create a PHP variable where I'm going to store the information so that this could go into an HTML table. Okay, so let's start putting the outer portions of the HTML table here. Okay, so here I'll put table border equals 1. Okay, and then that's going to be the ending part of it. Then what we're going to put in between here is going to seem a little odd at first. I'm going to put PHP echo $table data. Okay, so you see this line 15, it starts off with this start tag, it ends with this end tag. So I can put a PHP script right in the middle of this HTML markup. Okay, oops, I hit the wrong key here. Okay, so it says display $table data, but $table data is not even defined yet. Let's define it. Okay, starts off being an empty string. Now what I want to do is process $results and then create the actual string for $table data. You're not going to probably understand a lot of this stuff here, but eventually it'll make more sense. So we'll talk about it just a little bit today, but mainly I want to show you how this is going to work. I'm going to create a while loop. Okay, while $roll is assigned the value from $results, and I'm going to fetch something from the results. Okay, so what this is doing is when you call the fetch function, I'm going to use from the PDO class, this is the resolution operator, the 2 colons like this. In Java, the resolution operator is just a single dot. Yeah? So if I put the class name dot and I put the property, that's all I need. But in PHP, it's this double colon, which is actually like how it is in C++, if you ever did any C++ programming. Okay, so anyway, I get this row, and what I want to do is say $table data, okay, dot equals, which means equal to dollar table data dot, right? That's basically a shortcut way of basically saying we're going to concatenate it onto the end of this. I'm going to say dollar roll, okay, and I'll put in, let's see, from the cars, let me put in the make, okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put, let me go back a step. Better make this a little bit nicer. Dollar table data dot equals, and what I want to put in is a table row element. I'm going to take off the end of it. And then the ending of a table row. Okay, so in an HTML table, we got stuff inside of rows, and then in the row, we have to put it inside of either a table header element or a table data element. It makes sense for this to be just a regular table data element, so let's put that in. Okay, so TD, and I need to cut this and put it at the end here. Okay, but I got to concatenate these things. So here's a dot, here's a dot, and this has to be inside of quotes. Okay. So at first, when you're doing PHP programming and you're actually trying to display the results from a database, it starts to get confusing, or is confusing, because you gotta basically remember HTML markup. You got to remember basic HTML markup, and then you're combining it with PHP variables. Okay, so this is basically creating a table row. That's the idea behind it. So once again, if I go here, okay, and I want to run this, the first thing I want to do though is run it with -L, because I want to check for syntax errors, because I typed plenty enough stuff to have made syntax errors. Okay, luckily I don't have any syntax errors. Now I'm going to run it, and then it does this. Okay, so what it does is it starts the HTML markup. Okay, this is a table, and here's all the table rows inside of there. Okay, so that's what it looks like at this point. Okay. And you could add to it. Let's add to it a little bit. So that's one piece of data. And let's add another piece of data. And let's put in the model. Okay, so you might be wondering, where am I getting these names that I'm putting inside a dollar row? Fetch associative means return an associative array. Associative array is key value pairs. So the names of the keys are obtained from the database fields. So there was a field called make and another one called model. If I spell this wrong, not going to work because it doesn't match the name of the field name. But I can get the make and the model. I test this, okay, for syntax errors, then I run it, and then I get things like Nissan Altima, Nissan Leaf, so forth. Okay, so now, if I go back and I try to view this in the browser, how are we going to view it in the browser? Well, the name of this file is not first.php, but let's look at just up to php_test, because it's in the same folder. Then it displays both of these. Now, this is a security problem that allows me to do directory browsing. When you set up stuff, it shouldn't allow you to do that. But this is not 285, so this is just taking a look at it. So we'll just look at it this way. And I click on this, and that's what it looks like. Right? So this is just a simple HTML table with data from the database. If I were connected to the database and I changed the contents of the cars table, like I inserted a new car or I deleted some of the rows, and I do a refresh, then this table would change, right? Because it's actually connected to the database. Okay, so that should give you an inkling of how web applications work, right? You interact with the web application and then it can change what is displayed here. That's because if you do something that changes values in the backend database, then what gets displayed, because that's coming from the backend database, you can see something different on the screen, right? And that's actually, in a nutshell, how web applications are set up. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So is that like when you filter out, like, do you feel like being online shopping, when you filter items, is that?
That's correct, because when you do a filter, it changes the query that's being run on the backend database, so then what it returns is less. That's right. Now, let me qualify that. There are JavaScript libraries that will allow you to do the filtering just on what's in the HTML page without talking to the backend server, right? That's different, because what you're doing is saying, I got all this stuff, I display all the stuff, but I apply a filter so I have less to look at. I could apply another thing to sort it by a different column within there. That's done using JavaScript. That doesn't change any of the original query, it just changes the contents of the table. JavaScript is really the only language that can directly manipulate the contents of the HTML markup, and then that's what it actually does. Yeah? So it just changes that. So it may be talking to the backend and submitting a different select query, or it could be, if it's using JavaScript, it could just be changing what is displayed, but actually the original query didn't change, and the original results are there. It's just that you're choosing not to display all of them. Yeah, and so there's some really good, there's a JavaScript library called data tables, which is super good at doing exactly what I described, changing the view of the stuff depending upon applying a filter. Yeah. So it could be more than one thing there, unfortunately. You can't, but you can tell if you look at the page source, right? If I do Control U here, you can see this one is real simple. It just has plain HTML markup. If I had some JavaScript stuff that allowed me to modify the view, then you would see that at least the name of the JavaScript file that it's using in order to do the stuff. Okay, good question. All right, so that's a lot of stuff for today. I'm going to upload connect_lab1.php, but the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to make a new compressed folder of that stuff, and then just re-upload that new folder and then just wipe out the old one. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that. Okay, so I made a new php_test.zip, and here on Laulima, first thing, what I'm going to do is I click on this, I go upload new version, and I'm going to browse for it. And upload a new version. So it replaced it. So now it has the 2 PHP scripts inside of there. So you folks can take a look at that if you need to. All right, that's all I'm going to cover for today. If you ran into questions trying to do this, then hang around and ask. Otherwise, we'll continue with this a week from today, because Monday is President's Day holiday, right? So no school on Monday. Okay, so that's it. Raise your hand if you got any questions. I'll come around and look at what you have. Otherwise, we're done for today.